Welcome back to Great Karate Myths Debunking the Legends. In our previous episode, we touched on Gichin Funakoshi's vision for karate. And this week, we're diving deeper into a core concept of modern martial arts, the dichotomy of jutsu versus do. What's the creation of karate-do a useful development or a departure from tradition? We explore how Funakoshi was influenced by developments in Judo and Kendo, how the Meiji Restoration fundamentally changed the idea of martial arts, and why the term jutsu has been retrospectively and at times incorrectly applied to older kata. Get ready to challenge your assumptions about what the true karate really is. Matt, do you want to open today?
Yeah, I mean, I just wanted to pick up on a thread, really, that we started on when we started talking about Tenno Kata. We were talking about what Gichin Funakoshi was trying to create, what he was trying to promote. And it seems that a big aspect of that was karate becoming a do in line with other Budo that was, finding prominence in Japan at the time. And so I thought it might be interesting to just explore that idea of karate becoming a do. Gichin Funakoshi himself had previously defined karate as karate-jutsu. Some people might find that terminology slightly confusing. It does have particular meanings, and the attempt to recreate karate as a do implies a certain mentality, implies a certain practice. It certainly implies a certain ethic. So my question is, was that a departure, or was that a useful development? And what is the difference?
I think it's a creation. He's creating karate. He creates it in a kind of and organizes it in a way to align with Japanese Budo and the modern versions of military arts and martial arts in Japan. Whereas the jutsu terms sort of traditionally suggested combative skills, fighting skills. And as they kind of gradually fell out of use with different systems, and can I just cut in a second? So sorry, I just cut in because there's a really important point is that Funakoshi Jichin was inspired by and following what had happened within Judo, where basically jujitsu, jutsu, so a technique or sort of a military application, had been superseded by Kano Jigoro's idea for a way of judo, which actually became an international sport in his own lifetime, and that I think was so. Thanks for letting me cut in there. That's what I think Funakoshi Jichin Sensei was following, along with Kendo as well, as you well know.
Well, I suppose just a follow-up question on that then. Was this an attempt to create something new, or was this an attempt to popularize for mass consumption what had come out of China and Okinawa?
I think both. I think it was to create something new, and I think it was to make it. He's observing I think there was also political aspect to it as well, particularly in the 30s in Japan, and going 20s and 30s in Japan as well, and which that's a lot's been written about that. But yeah, I think it's creating it because Gichin Funakoshi was pulling together lots, as we said last week. He's pulling together lots and lots of different things. He's got forms from China. He's got forms that have been created in Okinawa.
he's in Japan, he's seeing other Budo, he's drawing on Japanese martial arts as well. We know he's drawing on jiu-jitsu, and he's exchanging, he's doing demos, he's seeing lots, and all of that kind of comes together and creates something completely new. But it falls in alignment with the Budo, the martial ways, which were more kind of about, I don't want to say specifically what they are because they're quite broad terms, but personal development that might include spiritual development and not leaning too heavily towards pure martial function or something like that. So there's a lot you can do in a kind of a Budo sense of things as well. And you can he was drawing on Chinese philosophy and Japanese philosophy as well. And you can see that in his writings as well. So it's bringing together a lot of really interesting different stuff to create something really quite new. And then there's the need to popularize it, and what's going to make it popular. A Chinese martial art in Japan at that time might not have been too popular. So it has to become a Japanese Budo in order to establish footing and grow.
Funakoshi Sensei said as much in the introduction to Karate-do Kyohan, 1935, when he said, he didn't think it was any longer appropriate for the art to be referred to as China hand, and wrote there that was the impetus for him wanting to change the meaning of the kanji, the characters, from China hand or Tang hand to karate, to empty hand. And although, he wasn't alone in doing that, because the end of with the Miyagi Chojun sensei had been toying with similar stuff. So there'd been a meeting in 1936 between a number of senior karate masters who really had wanted to formalize that. But the important context, I think, that needs to be developed here is that the whole idea of a do or a way, as opposed to a jutsu or a technique or an application, is or a martial combative skill or technique. That would be. Let's leave it there. The idea was birthed from the end of the samurai. So at the end of the shogunate and the reconstitution of the. So we're looking at the Meiji period. So in 1868, what happens is all the samurai are disbanded. They all have to give up their swords and remove their top knots, and no longer allowed to be worn in public. This is, I think my dates are pretty much right, but I stand corrected if necessary. But the Meiji Restoration ushers in a huge amount of modernism in terms of naval warfare, shipbuilding. If you look at historically, Japanese costume becomes incredibly westernized. Top hat and tails are being worn in courts and in political environments. Massive changes. The swords aren't being worn. All sorts of changes are ushered in, and the idea of martial arts is not connected with. We're not talking about cannons and guns. We're talking about swords and spears and jiu-jitsu type grappling. These are all then consigned to an idea of being a way, a do, rather than a martial application. So that the idea of do is now being promoted and pursued as excuse the lazy language, but the new groovy, trendy thing to do. And as I said earlier, you see it with the judo, which is no longer jujutsu or jujitsu. Jujutsu is probably more accurate. It's now developed into judo, the soft way, and and the way of the sword becomes known as not kenjutsu but kendo, and new arts are created, like so in 1936 the new art of aikido was demonstrated in a Tokyo department store by its founder and some of his students. So this whole drive became directed towards the creation of or the transformation of older belief systems, techniques, training drills, martial arts, into a new, more eclectic, progressive, socially useful tools for social development, personal development, and nation building in ways that they probably hadn't been displayed or promoted previously.
The terms do and jutsu as well really are not really applicable to the antique forms either. So the kata that have come from China, they're neither do nor jutsu because they're Japanese terms and they refer to different things at different times, but towards Japanese martial arts and systems. So there's this complete change from these Chinese forms and the cultures that they were born out of, and the functions and roles that they played in Chinese society make their way to Okinawa without the functions, we know, and we kind of discussed that. And then they come to Japan and it's completely repurposed. And so I think, politics aside, the transition of the name from China hand to empty hand is really appropriate because the forms are so far removed from where they started, and they were being completely repurposed and reused through the Pinan, and then Funakoshi, as we talked about last week, creating the Tenno kata and the Taikyoku kata and a way of practicing based on his observations of Budo in Japan and his observations of martial arts there. And I think it was appropriate to then use empty hand and also then apply jutsu and do as a way of describing that kind of development of the usage of those forms in Okinawa and his journey into mainland Japan. Yeah.
I think that the jutsu almost is almost a retrospective. I think certainly as Tom's absolutely, and he's filled out my more or less than complete previous statement. It's he's added to it beautifully because it actually they are not anything to do. Jutsu and do are nothing to do with the antique forms. But it would for certainly for us, it might be a matter of convenience to refer to Kusenku and Shinto and Pasai and so on as jutsu because they weren't designed to be a way. They weren't designed with the same thinking and purpose as the Tenno kata, for example, that we discussed at length in the last podcast. But they're convenient terms, and they really came to the forefront big time in now. The West has had karate magazines. That was a phenomenon, sort of launched in the 60s and full of all the various characters and personalities that inhabited those magazines, which are sort of analogous to muscle magazines and bodybuilding, and then you had the martial art magazines. And I don't mean to be sexist, and I don't intend to be, but these were sort of boys, in magazines, and they were, they were pretty basic in the. I didn't see them in the 60s because I wasn't born. I was born in the 50s, but I certainly saw them by the 70s, and and was fully subscribed to those that were around where I lived in the UK. And we had the usual black and white photographs of the kata and the suggested applications. And the idea really came suddenly in the late 80s. There was a craze. I'm going to try and avoid names, but the whole idea, an idea appeared on the martial art horizon, and in popular parlance, the pressure point fighting, and it was promoted by a very a person good at marketing from the USA who promoted this pressure point fighting and these sort of touch point knockdowns and knockouts, and it sort of became a craze, and it swept the West, it swept the USA, and it swept the West. The Japan and China Japan and Okinawa, beg your pardon, Japan and Okinawa kept a dignified silence in the main, with the exception of one or two individuals who came forward as promoters of the original material. But the idea of that the punch block and Japan Karate Association type applications to kata were false and inadequate, and that the real answer was were pressure points. I think meridians were included, and you could hit various points, and if you hit triple point, you hit 3 points on the arm and one on the neck, the person would be rendered, or a tap somewhere, and your opponent would be rendered unconscious. And this became really quite a fad, quite popular. And by way of explanation, a number of quite experienced and senior traditional karateka teachers, sensei, decided that this was the answer, and that this was the true karate. This was not karate-do, but karate-jutsu, and in fact, it was that firing off of that thinking that really inspired me, actually, to write the the Barefoot Zen, a book I did with Samuel Weiser, which was published in 2000. Obviously, I'd started compiling it several years earlier, and this came off the back of the first book I did. I'm not promoting my books here, and this is just factual stuff. The first Tuttle book, I think, came out in 94. By 96, the landscape of martial arts had really, of karate in particular, had oriented towards this pressure point idea, this pressure point knockdown and knockouts, and I found it difficult to accept or believe in that, and that was quite a that gave me some impetus to look deeper at what the kata did. Hence the book Barefoot Zen, which really ran counter to this karate-jutsu, knock 'em out, knock 'em down stuff that became really popular. It's obviously really subsided now, although it's still around. So Jutsu and Do were really highlighted as two completely separate things quite late within my lifetime, and realistically within my writing authorship lifetime, and as late as the 80s. They're pretty late, actually. The terms existed, and as we've described, as my colleagues, you chaps have described, the Funakoshi Gichin Sensei himself made a the distinction between jutsu and do, but this was sort of left alone for years, only to flower with the idea that Kyushu jutsu, that would do it. That would show the real karate, as opposed to this sort of dojo karate, this sort of twice a week dojo karate, which should not be disparaged. But the do-jutsu, as Tom correctly says, has nothing to do with the antique kata and everything to do with the modern form, the formulation of modern karate, which we've suggested, correct me if I'm wrong, gentlemen, but we suggested really starts with Funakoshi Gichin's creation of modern karate. And quite late.
It's a lovely point, and Nathan, and I think that there are things that have been quite carefully inserted into karate history quite later on, as you just pointed out. And with Japanese swordsmanship, for example, you get there's a definite period of warfare where swords were used, and the way that they were trained and employed, is the kind of what I suppose jutsu was, when it came into use, was referring to. And then that transition post Meiji Restoration into the kind of the Budo ways, what Do was referring to, where it no longer had much usage in combatives and warfare and things like that. That's been borrowed and put into karate, kind of suggesting that there was this golden age of karate where it was used for real fighting and real battles. And the pressure, it was alluded to that like you suggested, that the people said that the pressure points were used as a kind of deadly employ of karate techniques and all the rest of it. I don't believe for one second there was a golden age of karate-jutsu. I think it's something that has been placed into karate history, but in modern times, because those forms, there wasn't a lot going on with them. We know there was not a lot going on with them because no one has any idea of what to do with them, and they all become unarmed combat. It's not saying that people can't be creative and skillful with them. I'm not saying that, and I'm not criticizing anyone for what they do or what they practice. But the original function of those forms did not land. And so even if they were the most effective combative systems in the world contained in those categories, there was no period of those forms and those skills being employed as karate-jutsu for real fighting. It was something that was practiced and preserved, that I'm very grateful for. And as you said, I'm just kind of building on that point, that really you get this emergence of karate-do with Gichin Funakoshi synthesizing lots and lots of different things to create karate. And as we pointed out, you wouldn't need Tenmo kata or basics or anything like that if you already had fully fledged fighting arts, and he didn't. And so he drew on very careful, all the things around him. He even used we talked about Andreas Quast's article where he points out the pressure point chart came from jiu-jitsu. And a jiu-jitsu correspondence course, which Funakoshi subscribed to, and put that in his books. So we know that the pressure points weren't there. He borrowed that from Japanese jiu-jitsu once he's arrived in Japan. And so, it's kind of rewriting history a little bit, isn't it? We're using the Do and Jutsu and suggesting that there was Do and Jutsu have always been part of karate or something like that, but actually the usage of Do and Jutsu are very much modern inventions applied to karate. Not that they were invented for karate, but borrowed from Japanese martial arts and creatively used. I'm probably going to get in trouble for saying all of that, but
It was well said, and you developed the theme perfectly. And just to give attention and justice to the other main group of, or another main group of karate, because everything's been focused on Funakoshi Gichin Sensei and his Shotokan school. I just flick over for a second here, if I may, to the Goju-ryu tradition, or if you like, the Naha. So I'll include two groups in this: the Weichi-ryu of karate of Kanbun Weichi, and the Goju-ryu of Miyagi Chojun. These schools, based as they both are on the kata sanchin, and in the case of the Weichi style, traditionally consisted of sanchin, seisan, and sanseryu, 3 kata only. 5 kata were later added for reasons that we'll possibly discuss in the future. But the Goju-ryu developed its kata number to 12, but sanchin was ever the focus. And the difference, so the Goju-ryu and the Weichi-ryu, in line with everything that was happening in the karate world at the time of their inception as styles and their introduction to Japan. Although in some regards, actually, the Weichi may have been there first. I believe it was, but notwithstanding the idea, Miyagi Chojun, the very famous founder of Goju-ryu karate, the true Mr. Miyagi from the Karate Kid films, what Goju-ryu accentuated was physical development, as away from the jutsu. Miyagi Chojun created a series of Jumbiondu exercises using barbells and stretching and exercising. And Miyagi Chojun's sensei's approach to karate was a lot more PE based, physical exercise based, a lot more calisthenic and physical. And Funakoshi Gichin Sensei's system was, as a do, was slightly more oriented towards Japanese Budo ideas, and it may have been the influence of Nakayama Hakudo, a Kenjutsu instructor who Funakoshi Gichin associated with. That may have influenced Funakoshi Gichin Sensei's thinking, but the Goju-ryu of Miyagi Chojun gravitated much more to physical culture, barbells and dumbbells, chishi, sashi, lifting weights, and was had a different flavor. Notwithstanding, that was the way in which Miyagi Chojun Sensei turned the Naha kata into a do, into a way, and negated the need for absolute martial applications, which is quite strange because a lot of this was happening when Japan was actually quite militarized.
I'm all right in thinking that, particularly with the Shotokan stuff, there's a kind of a samurai aspect to it. The one blow, the one block, the one punch. It's always had that air to it to me, and that's what I think he was basing it all on, and to make it that spiritual
Gichin
system.
Funakoshi was certainly inspired by the Jigoro style of swordsmanship, which and that's where what possibly inspired the use of the makiwara, and we know that one of his teachers, Matsumura, had a teaching license in the Jigoro. Tosu possibly practiced it, and also Anko Zato possibly practiced it as well. So he certainly came into contact with it, and some of the kata names that Funakoshi changed, he used kata names from the Jigoro and also their ranking system as well.
So he's definitely inspired and influenced by it, and that the Iken Ditatsu, the one punch one, was probably inspired by the Jigoro, which they seek in there, is that the first cut does the job. But it's interesting because that influence, you can see, moves into the Tenno Kata, where you have the first half of it is really, I suppose, the intention is jutsu, because it's all the attacks, it's going first. And then the second half with the ukewaza and the block, or so-called blocks or receiving techniques, however you want to, and counters, is the do, isn't it? Embodying there's no first attack. And so it's quite interesting how the jutsu and do could be viewed as you start with the jutsu in the Tenno Kata and you arrive at the do in the second half. It's quite, I don't know if he intended that, but maybe I'm just kind of putting that together in my own head, but it seems to be the case given his influences, and that it was something that was discussed as well.
Yeah. And the contrast of Goju-ryu is, because I did Goju-ryu, so I remember it. I remember the she weights and all that stuff. It was very different. It was much more physically inclined rather than any sort of spiritual thing that was going on. There was none of that really in there. Compared to say Shotokan, which had that air to it.
Well, my thought on that is I wonder if, to some extent, the concept of karate-do, it didn't seem to take root in the Western mind. The Western mind wanted to keep promulgating the idea that karate was a functional fighting art, and you see a lot of contemporary interpreters of the various kata wanting it to be combative, wanting it to be fighting, which is why I raised the question really about the dichotomy between the jutsu and the do, because it seems to me anyway that the Western mind has really not wanted to move beyond the idea of the jutsu, and lots of contemporary teachers, quite literally make their money from promoting, the practical applications, the fighting techniques that are or are not within the kata that they're practicing.
I think the sort of the groups or the teachers that you kind of mentioned that are promoting their hardcore karate jutsu, where they'll take on all comers, I think that there's nothing traditional about it. I think it's a modern invention. It's an invented tradition. And they're inventing it as they go along. I don't think that a lot of the modern applications are drawing on, because we've got access to everything now, haven't we? We can see wrestling, grappling styles from around the world, fighting styles from around the world. You can be really, really, really creative with those kata. I mean, it's not that difficult to bring up some really, really great ideas and, some cool throws and relate it to this and connect it to that. But I think that's all being invented as it moves along. I don't think that's got anything to do with what was being practiced in Okinawa. There's certainly what's recorded and preserved about it doesn't suggest that any of that sort of stuff was going on back then. And so, it's an invented tradition. But that, that's okay. That's what people do, isn't it? Our style, what we practice, is an invented tradition. It's an invented style. So I don't think there's anything wrong with that at all. I think it's just kind of naming what is historical is important and what's new and made up. I mean, Funakoshi was being very, very creative that creativity has continued, and I'd encourage that in people as well. Certainly, but yeah, I think that's sort of it's a tradition on the move.
Are you saying, Tom, that a bit of woodland in Hampshire is not the equivalent of a sacred mountain with a sacred master? Yeah, where some guys got together and thought, what does this stuff do? And then they got we got our rear ends down to the university dojo where we had classes anyway, where we were teaching, and we spent 2,000 recorded hours there, and we didn't take the jutsu route, we took the technical route, and that's why we're probably rooted in such a I am anyway, technical approach. We are generally to what this stuff actually does. The historical side is fascinating and motivating, and the legendary stuff is great. These are the tales that inspire us. But at the end of the day, what does the actual kata do? So, I mean, there was a bit of a mechanic to all of us, which I never thought I was that sort of a person. I thought more likely to be inclined to writing or poetry, or not the grunt and sweat and leverage and falling on your back and getting hammered and physicals that I spent those 30 odd years doing, being involved with. But we ultimately the idea that this and I love what you said, Matt, that this stuff that it was there ever that it wasn't this, or I think it was you, Matt, but it never was this hoary tradition from long ago where it was deadly and it was applied. And as Tom has said repeatedly, we've all said repeatedly in our podcast, that most of the stuff was connected with weapons, or if weapons weren't being used, they were being countered. And certainly, and here's the rub, very little of this had anything to do with unarmed combat. So the idea of the ancient masters engaged in these sort of battles, no, not at all. And despite Funakoshi Gichin Sensei's wonderful vignettes or between the masters, they are anecdotes, and they are encouraging, inspirational pieces.
So there was something I was thinking as well was, do you think, because we spoke about Matsumura Shokan and the this idea of restraint in the antique forms, the idea of restraint, do you think that lent itself to the idea of do?
Yes, but retrospectively. I mean, what Matsumura Shokan actually meant, and whether he was kind of leaning towards a discussion on do and jutsu, I don't think so. But it's borrowing it from the past, isn't it? To kind of for what you're actively creating now. So what's being done with kata now? That Itosu, for example, and his 10 precepts, and Matsumura and his guidelines and all his guidance and all the rest of it, they weren't doing anything like what's being done with kata now. And the types of discussions that people are having about do and jutsu and what Budo means now and what Bujutsu means now, there are absolutely no. It would have been so different in their minds because it's so far removed from us. But we can borrow from them to kind of lend to our arguments now. But it's a kind of almost an active creation and using bits and pieces to essentially what Gichin Funakoshi did. because you're also using kata which have nothing to do with anything that Matsumura said, or Itosu said, or even Gichin Funakoshi said, or any modern research. Those forms had nothing to do with karate, really, or Budo, or Bujutsu, or codes of chivalry, or anything like that. They come from a very, very, very different culture, which is ritual, theatre, performative, martial application, religious, all one thing, or one kind of cultural expression that took place within their martial arts as well. So that's a world away. But if you're creating karate and evolving it, then you're going to lean on those things, and I think you could certainly lean on and borrow from Matsumura and Itosu to build up a modern, new version of Do or Jutsu. But I think it's important to state that that's what you're doing. That's my one quibble, saying that that's what they were doing, pressure points or advanced grappling or whatever, suggesting that that's what was being done. I don't think I think that needs calling out, quite frankly. Just one last very, very quick point. It's just reiterating something I've already said, but you can kind of get a modern experience of Jutsu and Do in the Tenno Kata. You've got the going first, attacking, one punch, finish, however you want to interpret that. And then you've got the second part of the kata, which is the Do, and embodying Funakoshi's precepts and all the rest of it, the way. But it's going to be. I think it's something that's open to be creatively interpreted, rather than it's not an actual part of. There was no jutsu period in karate like there was in swordsmanship, and the Do is borrowed heavily from the Japanese budos, and those ideas have been merged with karate as it developed.
Maybe that's what we'll be looking forward to in the next few years, as a revival of Tenno Kata and the spirit of Tenno. Watch out, there'll be more YouTube clips, I'm sure.
Well, here's actually just occurred to me. Here's a teaser to leave with. If I could carelessly suggest that the antique kata, the Kusanku, Chinto, Pasai, and so on, didn't start as karate. In fact, history says they originated in China. So I could carelessly call them kung fu. Just for a point to this, just to make this point. And so really, what bearing would they ever have on a distinction between karate-do and karate-jutsu? When in fact they actually originate with kung fu, and more importantly, they're all oriented towards involvement with weapons. Now, if that's the case for those antique kata received from China, does that have any implications for the broader subject of kung fu?
That's all the time we have for today on Jutsu versus Do. Our key takeaway: the forms are far removed from their origins, and the concepts of Do and Jutsu were borrowed and creatively applied to modern karate. The idea of a deadly historical karate-jutsu is largely an invented tradition. But as we acknowledged, creativity and modern applications are what keep the art moving forward. If you want to dive into the references we mentioned, check the show notes. Don't forget to subscribe and share. Thanks for listening.